Hello there, welcome to this presentation on ACCA's paper P1, Governance, Risk and Ethics. My name's Steve Wittenbury and I work as a subject matter expert for BPP Learning Media in the UK. Today I want to try and talk you through how you might approach a question in relation to corporate governance, and we're going to use a recent exam sitting question to try and illustrate this. The question we're going to talk about is from the June 2013 paper, and it's question 4, and it's in relation to directors' remuneration. Let's have a look and see what we're going to cover today then. Specifically, I want to try and talk about this question and think about how it relates to particular learning outcomes that you might be testing, and to think a bit about the style of question that the examining team would put together in relation to a governance question. This is perhaps slightly unusual in the sense that it tends to cover questions of different syllabus areas when you look at the optional questions on paper P1. In this instance, this is pretty much governance all the way, but you need to be prepared that a governance question might include elements of either the risk or ethics parts of the syllabus as well. So for this specific question, it's about fat cat salaries, it's about remuneration, and it's attempting to try and think about how you could approach this by means of good combination of exam theory and understanding the nature of how to blend together your knowledge and also your application for exam questions. In this instance, the key task is to try and consider how you might monitor and motivate members of the board of directors and provide them with the remuneration which allows them to expand the company's profits and grow, but also at the same time isn't done in such a way to encourage them to do it too quickly, to take the money and run, and to leave the company high and dry. So our task is then to think a bit about how these specific requirements fit together in order to try and address that. So there are 3 broad requirements, but I'm going to talk a bit more about how these requirements are split up because this is quite important for this particular question. The first requirement, part A, talks about codes of corporate governance, asking both what they are and what they're for. The second is trying to ask you how you might choose to balance a series of elements of remuneration packages in order to try and strike this balance of retention but growth. And then third and finally, we're going to focus upon the role that the scenario plays in terms of understanding what non-exec directors do, and then to think a little bit about how those non-executive directors should be remunerated and rewarded, and whether they should or shouldn't be rewarded in the same way as their executive counterparts. The question is worth 25 marks, as indeed all the optional questions are in section B of this paper, and the notional amount of time you're expected to spend in answering this is about 45 minutes. That includes reading, planning, thinking and writing, and perhaps considering what you've put together before you move on to the next question. You could, if you want to, pause at this stage. This presentation is stoppable and startable because it's online, and you have the opportunity to pause at this point and try and think about how you're going to attempt this question and even do it in time, and then press play again when you want to go through the solutions. And that's the approach I'm going to take now. Okay, so let's have a think about the specifics of this question and think a little bit about how we might provide overview points in relation to the solutions. You'll have copies of the solutions in front of you, either by accessing a document that you've obtained from your learning provider, or perhaps simply by accessing the solutions that the examining team provides online. In this instance, in part A, we've got 2 main requirements that you need to think a bit about. We've got the specifics about a code, and we know that codes are very factual. The idea of a particular code, in this instance of corporate governance, is designed to try and provide you with information about guidance, about why you should do things, also about trying to understand a little bit about why you should be doing it in order to avoid not doing it. And I think this is where the second part of the question comes into play, where we're talking specifically about the requirements and also the purposes of a code of corporate governance. And the solutions are quite clear in this instance, as indeed is the requirement, that you're to think about it in the context of this particular question. And we're told that this organisation is a listed business. So well-structured answers would not have only just concluded that a code of corporate governance was supposed to try and put into place the key areas of what it was you were supposed to do to encourage good behaviour, but it's also designed to try and make sure that if businesses stray or deviate from this approach, there is a regulator, a referee if you like, that is there to try and ensure that these things don't get out of hand, and indeed if action needs to be taken, that action is taken. So the principles of good corporate governance and why the code is there is designed to try and guide, inform and support. In section B, question B of this, you were asked to then consider how you might put together a package of remuneration that encouraged two possibly conflicting areas, the idea both of retention of members of staff and directors, but specifically in this instance also the remuneration package that would allow for the company to actually grow. Now there's a key requirement in this. Remember, the verbs that you're expected to think about and consider as part of the requirements are really, really important. And in this instance, the examining team chose to use a less well-known verb, which was propose. But that's not the crucial word in this instance. In this instance, the key word was how. How will you put together a remuneration package that will reward and motivate the board of directors to make them want to stay and also to make them want to grow the business? In this instance, you had to consider splitting your answer into two factors. The first of which to think about the growth aspects, how you might want to try and create some alignment or goal congruence between what it was that the company needs to do and how that can be motivating the individual directors for achieving that. And then secondly, the idea about retention. We would want to retain our directors because the idea of unnecessary churn and unnecessary inefficiencies in relation to recruitment, training, induction and so on is something we want to eliminate. We want a stable management team that's going to allow us the opportunity to be able to grow. And so your answer had to try and consider both of these aspects together. Aspects in terms of being able to align or where things might have been slightly more straightforward for you in terms of considering the aspects of performance-related pay, bonuses, possibly even considering them from a financial as well as a non-financial element as well. The third and final requirement talked about non-executive directors. And remember, there's an element of the scenario that asks you to consider how does a non-executive director operate? What roles do they play? Very much theory. And in contrast to that, you were then asked to try and say, in relation to the question raised within the scenario, how is it that you should reward these? Should these non-execs be rewarded in the same way? Should there be an element of profit or bonus attached to it? There are four key ways that you can describe the main roles of non-executive directors, and the examiner was very keen to try and stress that this was key theory that you should know. There are always elements of the theory that you should know, and we'll talk about those in a minute. And in instances of those, there are key requirements on people, in terms of risk, in terms of scrutiny and strategy. Strategy of the business, these non-execs are very good at what they do and they provide you with guidance and their experience. Scrutiny in terms of making sure that people are doing the right thing, and if there is something that's gone wrong, it is picked up on independently. The idea about risk and risk management, again, from experience. And then finally, the element that's perhaps most relevant to this particular requirement, the idea about their people role. Non-execs are there to consider who we should have on the board and, more importantly, how we reward and remunerate them in order to align them with the goals and incentives that match those of the business. Now, there's plenty of other issues to consider. The final issue is that of alignment of the non-exec directors' remuneration package with what's important to them in terms of what motivates them. We were asked to try and consider, should we be aligning the interests of non-execs and execs by rewarding them in the same way? The answer is fairly specific in this instance, and again, the theory that you use should be very specific as well. The key point to try and bear in mind is here that non-exec directors need to be independent of the people they're appraising. And if they're appraising and assessing what executives are doing, rewarding them in the same way is always going to be tricky. Now, you might quite easily turn around and say that if the non-exec director is employed to champion the cause of the shareholder, why not pay them in terms of share options, for example? And there are certainly some instances in the real world where certain non-executive chairmen, for example, are remunerated by means of that sort of share options scheme, perhaps. Those are, to a certain extent, a debate for a corporate governance forum that is perhaps outside the scope of this question. But it's important that you acknowledge that the theory tells us that we should be aligning our non-exec directors' remuneration policies with those people that they're attempting to try and protect. But more importantly, it's their independence that is of greatest importance. The notes that the examining team provide as far as the answers are concerned and the marking rubric to provide you with an indication of what scores a mark and what doesn't are fairly logical and straightforward, and I want to try and talk a little bit about how that's going to fit together now. In terms of the mark scheme, there's usually a fairly good way of establishing how well you've done on the basis of what the marks score, and the marking rubric will tell you that. You can also assess your own on the basis of how much you feel you've written. It may be that in some instances the examining team and the marking team decide that you may have addressed part of a point but not fully, and they may only award you a half a mark as opposed to a full mark. And the answers that you see in these mark schemes are designed to try and get across this idea of what you may be providing in terms of what you may get in terms of a return. What I think is of greater importance for you to consider at this stage when thinking about how well you got on is to think about what the examining team fed back. And I think this is one of the key bits of information that you can access after you've attempted any question. And it's all part of this process of reflection, which I want to finish off talking about at the end of this talk. This idea about reflection is all about how well you performed and how you could do better when doing similar questions when it's your turn to sit this exam. And the examiner's comments in relation to this question were extremely interesting. You'll notice we talked about how split the requirements were, especially for parts A and C, where there were individual requirements that were split up by the word and it's always really, really important that you can break down a requirement into sub-requirements as was necessary in this instance. Part A asks you to think about what codes of conduct were in relation to corporate governance, and the second part of that, Part A, asks you to then talk about why we have them. The examiner pointed out in great detail that a lot of candidates spend a lot of time focusing upon the first of these to the detriment of the second. And quite often you can actually see minor points awarded in terms of the theory when then considering the second element of this, which was the application. Similarly, in Part C, we were asked to think about the roles of non-execs, which a lot of candidates did, who then ignored why it was important to think about how they were rewarded in relation to their remuneration package. And again, that was a really important part of what it was that the question was looking for. But again, the examining team fed back that candidates spent far more time talking about the first and not the second part. It's really important for you to be successful in this paper, for you to attempt all parts of all requirements. Similarly, we also found that in Part B, although there was only one key part of this requirement, how can you balance growth and retention? The key word was how, not what are the elements of a package of remuneration for an executive director. And the examining team again fed back in their report to say explicitly that candidates who saw the idea of elements or components of a remuneration package and simply wrote whatever it was that they knew about remuneration packages, the idea then that we have an answer that simply states that is fairly easy to mark from a marker's point of view. It just scores 0 because it doesn't answer the question. And this answering the question is the critical, crucial aspect of how you should approach and attack a P1 question. Okay, you should hopefully have understood the question, you should hopefully have read the question, and you should hopefully have attempted it and perhaps even now debriefed it and seen where you went well and where you went wrong. Your key task after any question is to think about your final points, and I want to conclude by talking about what we've covered today so that you can then use this approach for every subsequent question, whether it's governance or whether it's beyond within the syllabus. The most important things are that you have to know your theory. Your theory is of crucial importance, and although the second point is to make sure that you read all points of the question and attempt them, the important element of that is application. Often the examining team likes to bring in an amount of theory and test your knowledge, but then secondarily it wants to make sure that you can apply it to the situation. For example, in this situation we were told that the company in question was a listed entity, and as a result listed governance requirements are always far more stringent than for businesses that are not listed. So key to this is knowing the theory and then how to apply it, and within that the requirements will tell you to do something and you have to make sure that you do everything within that requirement. Once you have attempted a question, it is also really important that you don't just look at it, see how well you got on and forget about it. You are always learning, you are never done. Right up until the time at which you sit the exam, you are still a work in progress. So next crucial thing for you is to think about reflection. How well did I do? What did I do well and carry on doing that? What do I need to learn from this? And what can I do to improve my future performance in similar and related questions? And the examiner's answers, as well as the examiner's report, both available online from the ACCA website, will provide you with invaluable guidance when it comes to thinking about how to prepare. Okay, this has been a very quick whistle-stop tour through one element of the ACCA Paper P1 syllabus, talking about governance. I hope this has been of some use to you, and when it comes to being your turn to sit this paper, may I wish you the very best of luck, and thanks for your time today. Bye now.